Welcome to Live by TV. I am super psyched to have you here. It's going to be a really interesting conversation today because we're going to be talking about something a little bit differently to compared to what we usually talk about as well. So, if it's your first time here, welcome to Live by TV. We are a part of Livewire Media. At Livewire Media, what we do is we specialize in corporate photography, corporate videography, and corporate video marketing as well. And Live ITV was really set up to help business owners in the current situation. And we like to interview like business experts in like mindset, marketing experts as well. And I think when me and Joe met a couple of weeks ago, we just immediately hit it off because first of all, we both have dyslexia, but I love her passion for this subject as well. And what was more interesting to me was actually like her story of how she came about discovering her dyslexia and the mindset that she kind of used to overcome it as well. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about overcoming the challenges when it comes to something like this, and also what exactly is dyslexia and uncovering some of the myths about it. But Joe, I'm going to hand it over to you. Give us a bit of a brief introduction as to who you are and what Joe Rees does.
Cool. So, yeah, I'm Jo Rees and I live on the Isle of Wight. And I'm a mum and I've got three children that are 15, 13 and 10. So
Gosh, I bet that's a handful.
it's a bit of a handful, yeah, but it's all good. And my background is in education. I trained to become a primary school teacher. So I just sort of did GCSEs, A levels, a degree, was the first person in my family to do a degree. And then kind of decided I wanted to be a primary school teacher and trained to become a primary school teacher. Interestingly, I didn't actually get my diagnosis of dyslexia until I was 34. So at the time of doing my A levels and my degree and my teacher training, I had absolutely no idea that I was dyslexic. I knew that dyslexia existed. You do a tiny little bit of it. I did a postgraduate certificate in education, in primary education. So you do just like a tiny amount of training, sort of like a day or so. So I kind of had an idea of what dyslexia was. And you kind of think, well, it's reversals of BDs, kind of perhaps difficulties with reading and spelling. But at the time of training to be a teacher, I had absolutely no idea I was dyslexic at all. It wasn't until I was 28 and I decided that I wanted to retrain to become a specialist teacher of dyslexia. Through my years of teaching, I just found I was drawn to the kids that struggled or the kids that just found it a bit more difficult. It was a bit like a magnet to them, and I just loved working with them and finding ways to get them to understand. It was like sort of a bit of a personal challenge. But if you haven't understood that, that's not your fault. It's I haven't explained it to you in a way that you've understood. So I was quite passionate about supporting children that were finding it more challenging to learn. And at the age of 28, I went off and trained to become a specialist teacher of dyslexia. And it was during that training that I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, they're actually talking about me. I think I'm probably dyslexic, and at the time I didn't get diagnosed because it didn't feel important at that particular time. So I kind of continued doing my training. I actually left working in primary schools at that time and I went to run a provision. The island had 4 provisions that supported, they were like outreach provisions that kids came to, and we supported using specialist dyslexic techniques, focusing on the development of reading and spelling. And at the time, it didn't feel important to get a diagnosis. And then it just got to a point in my early 30s, I'd had my 3rd child and I was struggling, if I'm honest, with my emotional well-being and my mental health, and I had quite high levels of anxiety. And also, my son was really struggling to make the progress that he potentially should be making. He was in year 1 and he was quite a bright kid, but just didn't seem to be making progress. So I decided that I would go and get a diagnosis to actually find out if I was. And sure enough, I was. And the rest, as they say, is history.
So you mentioned before that you went through some like mental health challenges as well, and that's fairly common, like especially with business owners as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a difficult thing to talk about, if I'm honest, in
Yeah.
some ways. But I think for me, if I'm being really honest here, I thought I had postnatal depression as a result
Mm.
of kind of having my children. And when I had some counselling as a result of that, what we discovered was that actually potentially it was my undiagnosed dyslexia that was the root of that anxiety. So what happens if you are dyslexic? It's a specific learning difficulty as opposed to a general learning difficulty. So that means that you have areas of strength coupled with areas of weakness. So you're aware that some things are really easy, but then other things are more complicated. And it's that kind of not understanding why you're finding things more difficult. That's what potentially causes the anxiety. And also, I think the anxiety comes from everyday life. So again, you sort of think dyslexia, well, it's only associated with reading and spelling, so therefore it only affects you in school or when you're studying. And it doesn't, it spills into every hour of every day. So, for example, one of the things I found really difficult when having 3 kids was I noticed that my strategy was I tried really hard to be invisible and to just kind of not be noticed. But suddenly you've got 3 kids that are making you really visible. You've got to remember to be at parents' evenings. You've got to remember to turn up to the birthday parties that they've been invited to. And it's kind of that organization and that time management. That's the bit I think that people don't really understand and don't really kind of get that it impacts. And I think that's where a lot of the anxiety can come from.
Yeah. I mean, tell us a bit about the misconceptions of dyslexia.
So I think I kind of said earlier, I think you think dyslexia and people think, oh, it's children reversing B's and D's, and it's, you know, there's this massive misconception that it's letters moving around on the page, and that is not dyslexia at all. That is a completely separate standalone difficulty. That's visual disturbance. And I think there's also a misconception that if you're dyslexic, you're not intelligent. It's children that potentially can't read, write and spell at all. And my attainment was always average at school. And lots of the young people and adults that I assess
Because
now,
you're quite academically smart, aren't you?
well,
You're very
yeah. So
because most dyslexic people they tend to struggle academically, but you're
well,
one of the few that thrived.
well, yeah, that's what's interesting. So I managed to achieve, well, a degree, 3 postgraduate certificates and a diploma. I've got enough credits for a master's, but I haven't done the essay bit that you have to do to actually turn it into a master's. But I think I'm able to cope on the surface, but the impact that has on attaining was where the impact came on my mental health and my emotional well-being, because I kept pushing myself to do more, but not looking after my kind of mental health, if you like. But interestingly, lots of doctors are dyslexic. You know, there are loads.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, lots of doctors are dyslexic. And the thing with dyslexia is it ranges across all abilities. And so in schools you will have children in your lower attaining sets right up to your higher attaining sets that will be dyslexic, because what it actually is so the difficulties with reading and spelling are the bits that you can see, but it's actually the bits you can't see that need supporting. So it's the working memory and the processing of language and information. So that's where the misconception lies. So quite often think, oh, dyslexics can't read. Well, dyslexics can read, and quite often we can read really well because we've got strengths with visual ability. So we learn to read using sort of sight vocabulary. But the minute it comes to attacking a longer word or reading lots of text and having to comprehend it, that's where we come unstuck. And that's where we quite often come unstuck in exams, which is why kids require extra time or maybe even a reader in some occasions to kind of compensate and bridge for that gap.
Yeah, I mean, when I was undiagnosed with dyslexia as well when I was at school, and the teachers always, because I was I'm classically trained, and the teachers always found it really odd that I could play like these really complicated musical pieces, but then I couldn't get 3 notes down.
I know, and it's really interesting because my son is actually really musical, because I talk about if you're dyslexic, I talk about that we have superpowers, we have special gifts, and for him, he's really musical. Now, when I say he's really musical, he's definitely not Mozart in as much as he really struggles with the theory side of it. But in terms of his practical ability to learn a tune and move it from one instrument to another instrument, oh my goodness, like he's so clever at doing that. And I think what happens is, if we're not careful, because we all have to go to school, and because I'm not questioning that we shouldn't go to school, education is really important. But I think the testing system in schools, what it does is, for dyslexic kids, it measures them by the thing that they find difficult. And because we're generally bright and articulate and we care, when the results come back and the results don't equal the effort that we've put in, it makes us feel a bit pants about ourselves. And then we begin to define ourselves by the things we can't do rather than all the wonderful things that we can do. And that's what I try and do with the kids that I coach, with my own kids and with myself. I try really hard to kind of empower them to find the things that they're brilliant at and define themselves by those rather than what they can't do.
Absolutely. I mean, you talked a bit earlier about finding your superpower. What's your superpower?
Well, my superpower actually is talking. And interestingly, I hated that superpower and detested it. And I've actually written a book about living with undiagnosed dyslexia called Don't Forget to Smile. And in there, I talk about, I think I was in year 7, so I must have been about, I don't know, 11, 12. And we did a competition at school about, it was a competition, a national competition. We had some traffic issues outside our school, and the council gave our school a budget to sort of do some traffic calming, to put some kind of speed humps in and to make it safer. Anyway, we won some national prizes for it. And I can remember being, it was amazing. And we were on television with it and all sorts. We were on Self Today and Meridian and everything. And every time I was chosen to speak, and I hated it because I was bullied quite badly as well, because I was perceived as being intelligent, even though I didn't feel intelligent. And every time I was chosen...
Did the other kids kind of see you as a threat, essentially?
I don't really know if they saw me as a threat. But I think there was this, I came across as quite confident. And this happens quite often. When I went for my assessment, the EP that assessed me said, Jo, you can't be dyslexic. Like, you just talk really well. But I think I come across as being confident, but actually I constantly feel like an underdog on the inside, and I'm terrified I'm going to be caught out. And I think, like I say, at the age of 12, I was kind of selected every time to be the person to kind of face up the campaign on the television or go and represent the school in the competition. And I can remember saying to my teacher, please choose somebody else. I don't give somebody else a chance. And him kind of saying to me, look, but you do it so well, you talk so well. And I think I hated it for such a long time. And it took me until really recently, in fact, kind of writing the book, I guess, to realize that's my superpower. My superpower is kind of talking and kind of sharing my experiences and speaking from my heart. And I guess inspiring others as well. I've done some crazy stuff in the last 6 years. So I feel, to be a good teacher, you have to remember what it's like to learn something new, because it's really easy to forget what it's like to actually learn something new. So I set myself a challenge every year. So 1 year I taught myself to run. I'd never run a race before in my life. And I ran a marathon.
I think just on that note as well, I think, like, as business owners, like, once we've learned something, it's very easy to become complacent, isn't it?
Definitely.
So talk to me a little bit about, like, and you've kind of touched on this earlier, but, like, I want to talk a bit about the mental health challenges that you had to overcome, because when you're diagnosed with any form of disability, people, in my experience, they put you in a box. I mean, when I was younger, I was diagnosed without testing for autism. My teacher just assumed that I was autistic and therefore started teaching me like an autistic person. And having stuff like that happen, it has challenges on your mental health, doesn't it? And you've clearly overcome them. So share us your tips.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not, it's not always easy. For me, running is really important. So if you'd have said to me, I hated PE at school. And I remember when I was 40 a couple of years ago, I actually ran a park run on my 40th birthday. And I can remember running around it. Yes,
you don't look 40 at all.
I'm older than 40. But I can remember running this park run with like 40 things on my head that my friends made me like wear. And And I can remember like chatting to this guy as I'm running around going, I can't believe if you'd have said to me 10 years ago that I would be running a park run for my 40th birthday, I'd have gone, don't be ridiculous. Like, that's never going to happen. But for me, being outside and running is time that enables me to not think. So as being dyslexic and with like the difficulties you have with processing, sometimes thinking is just really hard work. So the advice I give the parents of kids I teach is we need that time to zone out. It's really important that they find an activity, not necessarily running, but something that takes that strain away from thinking, that allows them to just reset their mind and just not have to put any strain on it and not do any thinking. And for me, I just love running because it's repetitive. I listen to my music and I don't have to think in that time. It just enables me to just kind of switch off and escape. And I think I do my best thinking when I run as well, like when you're not up like that, because, you know, you get to the point where you just can't think anymore. I think time management is really key. I talk about something called dyslexic overwhelm, which I have no idea if it's a real scientific thing or not, but I know I experience it and lots of the kids I work with experience it. So it's when you just get to the point where you've almost got so much to do, or a task seems so massive you can't find a foot into it. So it's about supporting them in breaking down that task and managing the time so it feels a bit more achievable. I know myself, I really find the end of terms difficult with 3 children and running a business as well. And I've got a husband, you know, so those times there are always lists everywhere. It's always written out on pieces of paper. But my big thing is accepting that I need help and asking for help. So again, I think because we are us, we don't know any different. So you develop strategies and you compensate. So you don't realize often that you are overcompensating or that you can ask for help. And it took me a long time to learn that it was A, okay to ask for help, and B, that I needed help, that I wasn't supposed to automatically know how to do that. And I think asking for help is really key. There is a balance, because sometimes I do come across kids who use it as an excuse. Oh, I can't do that because I'm dyslexic. And I think that for me says that they haven't come to terms with their diagnosis yet, and that they don't understand their diagnosis. Because if we truly understand our diagnosis and we truly understand how it impacts us, we can totally put strategies in place to overcome it. So yeah.
Just had a couple of comments come in. Guys, welcome to the stream. If you've got any questions for Jo actually around dyslexia and sort of managing the mental mindset of it as well, drop them in the comments below. We'll be sure to ask them for you. So Andy's commented saying, great discussion. And Josh has commented saying, this is exactly right. Never managed to pinpoint it. Thinking is effort and it's hard work. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, it's really hard work. And the trouble is, sometimes I think, you know, and it isn't true for all dyslexics, but most dyslexics I've come across are real perfectionists, and they aim to strive to be the best that they can be. And that is actually our biggest sabotage. Because, you know, perfect doesn't actually exist. It's taken me a long time to learn that, you know, perfect doesn't actually exist. And actually sometimes getting as close to perfect as we can get is okay. And I talk about, with my GCSE kids, I talk about framing our own success. So it's about running your own race and knowing what success looks like to you. So like when I ran my marathon, success was crossing the finish line. I had no time. It was like, literally, if I can raise a couple of grand for charity and cross the finishing line, that's a win, you know. Whereas for other people, they would have been wanting to have beaten a personal best. And you know, GCSEs is absolutely no different. You don't need 10 level 9s to be successful. You know, it's how we frame that success.
Guys, I would love it if you could share this stream out, because, and it's not for me, it's because the tips that Jo is sharing, it could actually help somebody else in their own life. So people like Jo may be sitting there watching this thinking, if you shared it with them, that I may have undisclosed or undiagnosed dyslexia. So I'd really appreciate it if you could share this stream out, because it could help somebody without you actually realizing it as well. And they would have thanked you for sharing this with them, because the tips that Joe is sharing, not only are they on point, but they're super helpful as well. I mean, if I had somebody like Joe in my life back when I was diagnosed with dyslexia, I would have been winning at life a long time ago.
It is. It's all to do with how you view it and how you frame it. And one
Yeah.
of my really awesome students, she was one of the first kids. So my company's called Another Way Round, and I've been going now. This is my 5th year of trading. And one of my first ever students, I'm so proud of her. She was taking her GCSEs when I started working with her, and she's literally just gone off to university to train to become a primary school teacher. So proud of her.
Amazing.
You know, she's dyslexic too, but she said to me, what you taught me to do, Joe, was you taught me that dyslexia doesn't have to be a negative. You taught me to flip it on its head and use it to my advantage. And you know, that still gives me goosebumps now that she said that. But it's true. Like you get, if you view it as a negative, it's going to be a negative. But if we can find, you know, there are ways to overcome it. And that's not to say that there aren't days where I blimmin' hate it, because there are. But the bulk of the time, it's about just constantly moving forward. And just, you know, if you have a bad day, it's a bad day. Get up again tomorrow and start again.
Josh has just commented saying, I always have a slow processor. Is that the case with a lot of dyslexic people?
Yeah, so it's not that you can't do it, it's that it takes you longer to do it. And this is why lots of kids end up in lower sets that shouldn't be in lower sets. And also, it's a mindset. I guess it's a mindset thing, isn't it? But there's a bit of a mindset that perhaps lower set kids can't achieve as much. And I don't
just want to clarify for our American viewers. So in the UK, we have like in our high school, we have different sets for different academic abilities, if you like.
Yeah. And I think lots of schools are moving away from that now, but there are schools that do still have that. And I think lots of the children, it's not that we can't do it, it's just that it takes us longer to do it. So exactly as Josh has said, it's like slow processing. So it's that, you know, it's just going to take you longer to think through to do a task. And again, that's where classrooms are unhelpful and the curriculum is unhelpful, because the curriculum that the government say teachers have to teach is so fast paced now. Even if teachers have got a gut feeling that kids haven't got something and want to spend longer on something, they're unable to, because they've got like a certain amount to get through. So yeah, that's totally classic.
Talk to us about, like, and you've kind of touched on this before, but how did you overcome your biggest challenges?
Oh, so biggest challenges. Oh, so I think for me, one of my biggest challenges was setting up another way around. So I'd worked in school for nearly 16 years, and you know, working in school, you get a nice salary at the end of every month, and I really loved it. I talked about, for a long time, for about 3 or 4 years, I talked about setting up on my own, and just wasn't quite brave enough to do it because it just felt so overwhelming. I just couldn't work out where to start with it. And when I look back, the company was like that. And when I wrote the book, it was a bit like that as well. It just feels sometimes when you want to do something and you set a goal, it feels so huge, you're not quite sure how to overcome it. So I think it's about breaking it down into really small steps. And just looking at what you can do today and what needs to be done now, and then worrying about like the rest of the stuff sort of like tomorrow. So I guess it's about prioritizing stuff, list writing, color coding, looking at what needs doing now. There are definitely times when my dyslexia gets in my way. So obviously, as a specialist assessor, there's a huge element of report writing involved.
Yeah,
I still can't proofread my own work. Like, it doesn't matter how many times I read something, and I usually read my reports 4 or 5 times. I still can't pick up typos or things that I've written myself. So it's about, I've had to ask for help. I've had to get systems in place to help with that. I've had to look at technology that can read things back to me. But also it's accepting that there is an element of kind of being human in that. And again, it's that whole perfect thing. And if reports do go out and there's 1 or 2 typos, it is not the end of the world. You know, it is not the end of the world, and it doesn't devalue the piece of work. But there have been days around academic stuff, like certainly when I was doing my degree, that I have felt totally overwhelmed and thought, oh my goodness, will I ever get through this? But I don't know, I guess I focus on the goal, like I focus on the goal and then somehow find a way to get there.
So for you, is it safe to say that the trick is essentially to focus on the end game and then ask for help in the process to get to your end game?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think it's got something to do with mindset and believing that it's possible. And I think the big thing I've missed out possibly is the support that I've had. So my parents have always really supported me. I've been married for a very long time, and my husband is really very, very supportive of me. And I think there's something to be said for that kind of, in terms of, we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know what I mean? That kind of keeps you safe. So it enables you to sort of push yourself and keep making, kind of moving yourself forward. But I think if it depends, doesn't it, what you're surrounded by? And again, if I think back to some of the kids that I work with, and I think back to when I worked in schools, and one of my big frustrations is you've got lots of children that don't know any different. So they're just living that same cycle, and they're getting what they expect because that's what their parents got. And school doesn't particularly seem important because their parents had a negative time at school. So it's finding a way to sort of break that cycle. And I think for me, I'm always looking for another way. And I don't know if that is nature or if that is nurture. But for me, I just like to constantly keep learning and growing. It feels important to me.
I was going to say, like, do you do any personal development yourself? And it sounds like, from the sounds of what you're saying, that you do.
Yeah, loads of personal development. So I've
Have you
got
got any recommended books?
I'm really into Brené Brown at the moment. Really
Oh,
into
she is
Brené Brown.
brilliant.
Yeah. So I'd say, and I'm listening to her podcast as well at the moment. I've read all sorts. I can't think off the top of my head, but I would say Brené at the moment is just really resonating for me. Brené, like I know her, but yeah.
Yeah, she is really good. She's really good at helping people overcome like their sort of limiting beliefs essentially as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. And I
And I
think,
what
and I do think with dyslexia, it could be a limiting belief for, like, it could be, you could think, oh, I'm dyslexic, so therefore that means I can't do X, Y, and Z. Well, yeah, you are going
yeah.
to find X, Y, and Z difficult, but what about A, B, and C? And let you know, there are loads of other letters in the alphabet we could be looking at. So yeah.
When you were diagnosed with dyslexia, what was going through your mind? Like, was it a sense of relief? Was it a sense of confusion? What
It
happened?
it's well, the irony is, like I say, I talk about it in my book. The irony is I actually turned up for the assessment on the wrong day, which just about sums me up. I turned up a day early. I was so terrified of missing it. I actually turned up a day early, and had to go back the next night. But I think there was definitely a sense of anticipation. There was definitely a sense of worry. My biggest fear was, what if I'm not dyslexic? That just makes me stupid, was the thought that was running through my head.
Yeah.
And when I actually was told I was dyslexic, I honestly thought I might cry, but I didn't. I just laughed. Like, the relief was just, I talk about it in the book in quite a flowery language. I just felt like relief just washed through me, and it just felt really healing, because suddenly all of those things that I'd struggled with made sense. So, for example, when I was at university, didn't really have a social life, because I spent all of my money that I could have been spending on going out on books, because I couldn't borrow a book from the library because I couldn't read it quickly enough. So I used to buy my own books so that I could read them as many times as I needed to, refer to them as many times as I needed to. And I would literally spend hours and hours and hours reading books over and over again. And I would sort of pick 3 from the reading list and know those inside out and just quote from them. And sometimes it felt like wasted time, because I would literally spend hours on an assignment and I'd never got anything higher than a B for an
Mm.
assignment or a written exam. And I think, oh
That,
God, like, is that effort like worth it?
I think that's the
Um,
thing though with people like psych. I've experienced that myself having dyslexia. That you often have to try or do things or put as 3, 4 times as much effort in as other people to get just that little bit closer
Yeah.
to your result.
Yeah.
And you sometimes question. I mean, I remember putting like a week's long work into a presentation for an English lesson for then the teacher to say, "Oh no, you're dyslexic. Don't worry about it." And it's like I put all this effort in. I want to
I
present
know.
it.
It's really hard. It's really hard. And again, I feel like kids give my worst bit about dyslexia is that kids give 110% and nobody notices that effort. So like
Yeah,
my 110% only ever amounted to a B, which for me, that B was like an A star.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But it is for lots of our kids. Well, our kids, my kid, with dyslexia, I talk about all the kids I teach with them, my kids. I feel like for them, it's that effort that's not acknowledged. And as you say, that's really damaging because we're desperate to please and we're desperate to do well.
Yeah.
And that
Just
is, if you don't understand your diagnosis, that chips away at you and makes you feel pants. There's no getting away from it.
just on that note as well, like, because there's a lot of parents that are going to be watching this as well. A lot of busy parents, a lot of very successful parents. What would you say to them, say, if their kid did have undiagnosed dyslexia, or even if their child in touch wood isn't performing as well as they would have liked? What would you say to that parent?
I would say I think it's always worth having a conversation with school. Schools do screens, schools don't tend to do full diagnostic assessments. They just don't have the budget. And if they did it for one, they'd have to do it for too many, and they just don't have the budget to do it. So always have a conversation with school. Now, sometimes for no fault of the schools their own, as I said at the very beginning, you actually get very limited training on dyslexia. I mean, I was passionate about SEM when I did my teacher training, yet I really didn't know what dyslexia was until I went to do my proper
What
training.
what is SEM?
Sorry, special educational needs.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a term that I don't know what they would use for American viewers, but UK definitely SEND, you might hear it referred to, special educational needs and disabilities. Sometimes schools don't necessarily know what they're looking for, and it's not their fault, but they're looking at progress. And if you've got a kid that's kind of attaining average, they're happy with that because they're sort of doing what they should be doing. So
Yeah.
what I would say to parents is trust your gut and contact a specialist. There are loads of us out there. I mean, obviously there's my company, but there are loads of specialist dyslexic assessors out there. Contact one, reach out, ask the question. There are loads of free checklists and screeners out there. I've got one on my business Facebook page. As I say, there are lots of free ones online that don't diagnose, but just give you a bit of an indication as to whether it is worth having a conversation with somebody or not. But don't sit on it. That's quite often the parents will come to me and they'll say, "Oh, I've thought about doing this for about 3 years and left it and left it and left it. And now it's come to them taking their GCSEs and I really feel like we should do something about it." And then they're just really frustrated because they've sort of lost 3 years that they could have been doing mindset work and stuff. So I would say trust your gut feeling.
Talk to us about the strategies that you use to support adults and children.
So it's a two-pronged attack, really, I think. So a big bit of it is mindset, confidence, self-esteem, believing that's possible, understanding that you are enough, understanding that your effort is good enough. If you know that you've given it everything and you're still not getting A's or B's, that's okay. So a big bit of the support I do is around that. I do assessment as well, which obviously gives you the diagnosis, which in itself can be life-changing. My diagnosis was definitely life-changing. The feedback I quite often get from parents is my child is just walking taller. It's like they've just had a weight lifted off of them because suddenly they can make sense of all the things that they find difficult. And then I provide coaching support to develop reading and spelling strategies. So you're always going to struggle with spelling, probably as a dyslexic, but that's what spell check's for. That's what I say anyway. But obviously you need to be able to kind of spell well enough to function in exams and things. And there are things we can do to support the development of reading and spelling. So for example, we teach something called phonological awareness. So that's learning how words are made up and looking at how the sounds match the letters. We do quite a lot of work on vowel sounds, on identifying syllables, on rhyme. And again, it might seem a bit like, well, my child can rhyme, but actually it's about using those strategies to help them with spelling. We use something called metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. It's thinking about what we know to work out what we don't know. And it's about thinking about where our start points are and building on those.
Yeah, amazing. What about adults? How do you support adults?
So again, I sometimes support adults with reading and spelling development because that's what they need. But more often with adults, it's more about them getting the diagnosis, so that quite often adults come to me because they've had they're experiencing difficulties with mental health or anxiety, and they just need to know so that they can get the support they need from work to help put strategies in place. So sometimes it's about diagnosis. Sometimes it's about looking at what technology we can use to support them. So for example, using audiobooks, dictating emails, essays, using proofreading software. And I mean, so much of this stuff is free now. There are free apps out there to do lots of this stuff. So yeah, but again,
Amazing.
adults, I guess it's mindset as
Yeah.
well, and just helping them kind of negotiate their way through it. And there's always a period of time where you have to process that diagnosis. Everybody processes it slightly differently. And for some people, it is almost like grieving, I think, in a way, kind of coming to terms with the fact that you've got this thing that has kind of perhaps got in your way or stopped you achieving your potential, but then rationalizing it and finding kind of a new normal and moving forward from there, using it a bit like a trampoline, I guess, if you like.
Yeah. What would you say to, because there's still a massive taboo around anything to do with disability or mental health. If somebody does have dyslexia and they're not getting the support that they need, what would you advise them to do?
Well, it's going to
Because
depend. I guess
I
it's
was going
going
to
to
say,
depend on the age, isn't it?
yeah, that play too, because I imagine that for an adult, it takes a bit of a self-acceptance to accept that actually there's something not quite right here. There's maybe a bit of an ego thing as well. What would you say to them to say, actually, in a nice way, get over yourself and get support?
Well, I would say my tough love approach would be it's fear, isn't it? A bit like me. There
Yeah.
would be this fear that, oh, she could assess me and I might not be dyslexic. And therefore, what's wrong with me if I'm not dyslexic? So I think potentially it's fear. And we come back to Brené Brown, don't we? Because she talks about how
Mm,
we have to brave the wilderness and overcome fear. But I think and it is about being brave, because it's not an easy thing, and you might not like what we find. We might find that you're mega dyslexic, but what I would say is it only has to be a stigma if you let it be a stigma. It doesn't have to be a stigma at all. There are, well, they say 1 in 10 are dyslexic, but I think it's probably higher than that.
yeah.
The more we learn about it, and the more schools are screening whole years of kids, you sort of see that actually potentially the prevalence might be higher than that. So I think, for adults, it's about being brave. For lots of adults, the barrier is the money for the assessment, and I've yet to find any charities that will support with funding assessments. So if anybody knows of any, please let me know. Because quite often that can be a barrier, because by the time you're an adult, you just don't have the money to prioritize necessarily on yourself. With children, I think it is about asking school to support, and if school won't support or haven't got the budget to support, you are going to have to seek it yourself. And what I would say is potentially you may require some emotional support as well as some sort of academic support.
Yeah, amazing. Just want to read out a comment that we've had in from Josh. Josh, welcome to the stream. I believe it's your first time here, so I'm super psyched to have you here. So Josh has commented saying, I've always noticed that I cannot remember 3 things. As a child, it was so frustrating. If I was sent for 3 things, I would only ever come back with 2, then have to go back again. Still to this day, it drives me nuts. Always assumed it's linked to it. I've only ever read one book. My brain needs the same line over, reads the same line over and over, and the words just don't go in. Thanks for helping my understanding.
Yeah. That could have been a paragraph from my book I've written, Josh, because that just about kind of sums it up. But it's really interesting. Quite often, parents will say to me in like the initial consultation, they'll say, "My child just can't remember 3 things." Exactly that. And what I say to them is a strategy for that is you just need to lessen your language and use a lot less language. So, you know, by saying, "Go and get your shoes, then get your bag, then please go and clean your teeth," or whatever order you want to do them in, you know, there's just too much language there to process. And what happens is when a child doesn't respond quickly, we bark more language at them. "Come on, I've told you to." And we might give them the instructions in a different order. So straight away, their head is just trying to process and make sense of all that language. So what I tend to say is just totally lessen your language. Teeth, bag, shoes. Like, which, because that way your instruction's really clear and they're literally just having to process the word. That can sometimes help.
Amazing. Guys, I would love it if you could share this stream for me as well. I know that I think some of you did earlier. And it's not sharing it for me, sharing it for the people that actually may benefit from watching the stream, because like Joe said, there's lots of other people out there who have undiagnosed dyslexia. Maybe their children has got it as well. So by sharing this stream, you could be indirectly helping them. And I would love it if you could do us that favor. Share this so that it can help other people out as well. Because believe me, if you have dyslexia, having that support is an absolute game changer.
Yeah, absolute game changer. I think the other thing which is interesting is it's having somebody that believes in you. When you said earlier about overcoming challenges, you know, like I say, I have been really lucky. My family have always been really very supportive of me. And, you know, my husband is a real champion of me. And it is having that person that really believes in you when you don't believe in yourself. Because I think one of the kind of misconceptions and the hidden things that comes with dyslexia is the confidence and the self-esteem, because it feels sometimes like you're being constantly chipped away at and your efforts not being noticed. It can become quite easy to give up. But also, touching on what you said about the adults earlier and being kind of brave enough to come forward, there's something to be said for sometimes it's easier not to confront it and get the answers than it is to just sit back and not know. So it's a bit sort of self-defense. So quite often I've worked with quite a lot of kids who are very disengaged and are really acting out in school and their behavior is off the wall. And when we've actually unpicked that and we've looked at that, it's because they're so terrified. They're so terrified that actually trying something and making a mistake and getting it wrong is more terrifying than just sitting back and not doing anything at all, or spending an hour stood outside the head teacher's office. You know, to learn, you have to be brave. It's much more complicated than, do you know what I mean? There are so many factors. There's confidence, there's self-esteem, there's resilience, there's experience, you know, there's believing you can do it. There are so many elements involved in becoming a successful learner. You know, there's motivation. If you've never finished a piece of work, I worked with a group of kids once and they had never finished a piece of work. I sat down and chatted to them and I was like, "Look, why are you always so difficult?" And they were like, "Because, miss, we never finished a piece of work ever." And I was like, "What do you mean you've never finished a piece of work?" And they were like, "We've never finished a piece of work." Well, if I never finished anything, I'm fairly sure I don't think I'd ever start it either. You know, so it's about looking at that. It's also about looking about motivation. You know, for lots of teenagers that I coach, if you've got no idea what you want to do when you finish school, GCSEs feel pointless. Whereas if you've got a bit of an idea where you're heading to after you finished your GCSEs, you can suddenly frame, well, actually, if you want to go to college and you want to train to become a plumber, you're going to need your maths and your English and maybe your science. So let's focus on those. So it's about
how can parents help their child decide what it is that their child actually wants to do?
Well, there's a question. It's difficult, isn't it? We need to play to our child's strengths, definitely. That's advice I always give parents. You know, find the thing that your child is good at and exploit it. Put them in front of it as many times as you possibly can. So I definitely think it's about, as early as possible, putting them in front of all sorts of things so they can try things out and they can find what they're good at and what they're not good at. I think it's about going to open evenings and looking at what's on offer for them. But it's about what makes them tick. What do they really like? What are they really good at? And that's what we should be pursuing.
Yeah. Do you find that parents often push their own agenda?
No, interestingly, not with
That's
the
good.
kids I work with. They just want their kids to be successful. And
Yeah.
quite often, particularly if kids come to me GCSE time, they're like, I just need them to get maths and English. If they can get maths and English, I've achieved it. And in a way, sometimes their expectations are a bit too low. And I'm like, actually, they could be getting X, Y, and Z as well. So certainly the majority of parents I come across are realistic and just want their kids to be happy and successful, whatever
Well,
success looks like for them.
so you say that the majority, but I think from my experience, it can take some acceptance from the parents as well to accept that actually I have a dyslexic child and I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. um with any sort of disability that a child is diagnosed with, or as an adult you were diagnosed with, there is going to be a period of time where you need to process it, and you are almost going to grieve for what you've lost, definitely. But that's where we have to flip it on its head and we go, no, we haven't got that and we haven't got that, but what we have got is this and this, so let's use this to our advantage, and
Yeah,
let's go with it.
amazing. So you kind of covered this throughout the interview as well, which has been amazing. But if you could just summarize, give us some tips on how people can manage dyslexia.
For me personally, I feel having a diagnosis is central. Now, you don't have to have a diagnosis to be successful, but for me, I feel having a diagnosis is key, simply because if we know what we're dealing with, we can then put the right strategies in place and know which paths we want to take. I always use the example when I'm training teachers, I've got 3 cans with no labels on them. And I say and then I've got a plate, a cup, and a bowl, and a knife, a fork, and a spoon. And I say, if I was to open this can and it happened to be soup and I poured it on the plate and tried to eat it with a knife, it's gonna, you're not gonna get the best out of the soup. The soup's gonna spill everywhere and ruin everything else. Labels don't have to be negative. What a label does is it tells us what we've got on the tin, so we know how to get the best out of it. And for me, having that diagnosis is key, because we know where somebody's strengths are, where their difficulties are, and what we need to do to move them forward. So that would be my kind of first thing. My second thing would be not letting it define you negatively. So not thinking, oh, I'm dyslexic, I can't do that. Oh, I'm dyslexic, I'm never going to be any good at that. It would be about finding your own personal positives, your own personal superpowers, and using those to define you. And then my third probably would be asking for help, knowing that it's okay if you don't have all of the answers. I can remember for me, I used to feel if I'd sat in a lesson and listened and I still didn't understand it, for a long time I was thinking, God, this is my fault. I must be really stupid because the teachers taught this to me and I don't understand it. And I felt like I should know the answer. And I guess it's the same with life sometimes. You kind of feel like you should be able to do it. So I think it's accepting that it's okay to ask for help. And help might be asking somebody in person, but equally it might be doing a course, or it might be, looking at YouTube videos, or it might be reading more about something. But yeah, definitely asking for help. And then my fourth and final thing, I reckon, setting goals and working towards something. And that's just a good life tip, isn't it? But kind of looking at where you want your next step to be and working your way towards that. Don't stand still. It's boring if you stand still.
And I like your tip earlier about keeping things simple when it comes to setting instructions, because I think as when you're dyslexic, when you get a lot of information thrown at you, it just sounds like words.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what dyslexia actually is it's not really it is a difficulty with reading and spelling, but actually it's also a difficulty with processing any sort of language. So whether that is written language or whether that is spoken language, it's the way we process it and the way we file it. So
I remember
less language is often like more effective.
I remember I was doing a college test, and the teacher came up to me and she goes, I want you to read this paragraph and I want you to tell me what happened. And I was able to do that fairly because the story was fairly like simple language. And then she got the exact same story, slightly more complicated text. And then she goes, I want you to tell me what happened. And she's a bit cheeky. She goes, I'm going to show you a different story, even though it was the same story. And then she goes, the reason that you couldn't remember the story for the more complicated text is because your mind was too busy trying to process the words that was actually going through
Yeah.
your mind.
Yeah. So that's called like the mechanics of reading, if you like. So quite often, so this is, we come back to that myth that dyslexics can't read. So we can generally read and read quite well, but actually our little working memories are working so hard on processing and doing the mechanics of working out what the words are. We've got no space left to make sense of it, which is why we have to read things several million times.
I was going to say, like, have you got any tips for people who wanted to read better and maybe write better?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of courses. There are quite a lot of courses around. I mean, on the island. Oh, it's the sound gone funny. On the
No, my
island,
college.
on the island, there are like loads of adult learning courses that are available
Yeah,
that aren't necessarily GCSE, but sort of functional skill type courses. So if you wanted
yeah,
to improve, you could definitely look into your area and see if they've got things like that. But I find, for me, like I say, for me personally, dictation has changed my life. And interestingly, my son taught me this. So he's just recently started, so he's due to take his GCSEs. And he dictates emails, notes, everything into his phone using a free app. So certainly, if you're ever worried about, quite a lot of parents are worried about when they give me paperwork and things, they're all, please don't judge the spelling. And I'm like, seriously, I'm the worst speller in the world. Like, don't worry about it. No judgment here. But I think, you know, dictating stuff can just help you get your ideas out a bit more, and then you can move it around and work on it that way. So definitely that can potentially help. And in terms of reading, you know, Audible is an amazing resource. I'm not going to lie, I don't really read books now. I listen to them on Audible when I'm running or when I'm in the car. You know, you don't have to read anymore. And again, there are, you know, most iPads and tablets, you can activate accessibility software so that it does so that it
it reads
reads
it
to
for you.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Where can people get in touch with you to find out more about your services?
So my business Facebook page is called Another Way Round. So yeah, so inquiries can come through there. I've also got a website, Another Way Round Dyslexia Support. So yeah, please feel free to contact me on there.
Fantastic. And guys, Jo is absolutely fantastic at what she does because having dyslexia myself, I know that there's very few people in the world that are like Jo. And I really love your technique about how you help people as well. It's such an organic process.
Yeah,
So yeah.
I'm really passionate. For me though, my real inspiration, he might shoot me for saying this, but it's my dad. So my dad believed that he wasn't intelligent most of his life because he didn't do well academically. Now, my dad is one of the most intelligent people I know in terms of problem solving, in terms of thinking, in terms of being practical. He was just taught in the wrong generation.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I can't remember what I was going to say now, but I think for me, well, that's what I was going to say. My real passion is I want people to know that they are enough and that they are intelligent. And just because they're finding reading and spelling difficult does not mean they haven't got something to offer the world and that they have to, you know, they end up in a job that they don't love. Do you know what I mean? That for
Yeah.
me, it's really important that I help people become all that they want to be, not all they feel that they can be.
Yeah. Guys, I definitely recommend connecting with Jo. Even if it's just for a one-to-one, do it. It will be so worth your time. So guys, we're going to wrap it up here. But if you would like to be interviewed on Livewire TV, we're taking bookings for next year, and we specifically want to speak to people about like business strategies, mindset strategies, and even marketing strategies as well. And on that note, do join us next week live right here, 12 p.m. UK time, GMT time, that is. We're going to be talking about how you can launch a product or a service into an international market. It's going to be super exciting and super juicy as well. So make sure that you're here. Guys, we're going to wrap it up here. Jo, really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've loved it.